It's my pleasure to be here. A live report issued by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimated total revenues for the global drug trade to be $320 billion per year, greater than the GDP of 80% worldwide. Similarly, the U.S. federal and state prison population reached a new 1.5 million in 2007, an increase of 15% since 2001. Around one-half of federal and one-fourth of state inmates locked up for drug offenses. Clearly, the war on drugs, as Rob pointed out, first initiated by President Richard M. Nixon more than 35 years ago, has been a failure, certainly in stemming the global or domestic drug trade. And yet drug policies have changed little, if at all, since Nixon's pronouncement. As I argue in my book, The Myth of the Addicted Army, Vietnam and the Modern War on Drugs, the growth of the modern U.S. drug war by Nixon was the product of domestic hysteria that developed as a result of exaggerated stories about the use of drugs by American soldiers in Vietnam. Amidst widening dissent against the war, including from U.S. troops, which is a well-known a story as it should be, Nixon exploited public concerns about drugs to his advantage. Found the perfect political remedy to deflect public attention away from the horrors of the war in Vietnam and popular opposition to the war. This is the basic thesis of the book. The issue of drugs in Vietnam first grabbed the public's attention in January of 1988 with the publication of a controversial article in the Washingtonian magazine by the son of the famous novelist John Steinbeck, entitled "The Importance of Being Stoned in Vietnam." And Steinbeck claimed in this article that 75% of soldiers smoked marijuana in Vietnam, and that, quote, the average soldier sees that for all intents and purposes, the entire country is stoned. To enforce prohibition against smoking the plant in Vietnam would be like trying to prohibit the inhalation of smog in Los Angeles. Words were evocative, and drugs were certainly prevalent in Vietnam. There was an element of exaggeration. Military psychiatrists working closest to the situation found that between 30 and 35% used marijuana during their tour, largely on an experimental basis, to escape the harsh realities of war, and in some cases, defiance. Toward the end of the war, roughly 5 to 10% experimented with a form of smokable heroin known as skag, which was made available by the opening of transportation routes following the U.S. invasion of Cambodia in 1970. A disillusioned veteran who had been arrested on marijuana possession charges, Steinbeck overdramatized the scope of drug use in Vietnam because, as he told his famous father, who his outlook, that, quote, if they were smoking it as respected and lauded soldiers over there, how could it be they were criminals in America? What I wanted to do was to paint this ridiculous contradiction. Rife with exaggeration, Steinbeck's article nevertheless had an effect far beyond its original expectation. It gave rise to the term "the myth of the addicted army." It alleged that drug use was widespread or omnipresent in Vietnam, contributed to the breakdown in the military's fighting capabilities. Adopting hyperbolic epidemics and plagues, proponents of this myth equated all drug use with abuse and downplayed the differences among drugs. Marijuana, for example, as being equally powerful and addictive as heroin. They neglected the social context in which GIs got stoned, including the link to anti-war protests within the military, which was quite marked, and also the confinement of drug use mainly to the rear, not to the front lines. Proponents of the myth further blamed drugs for a host of military problems, including lack of discipline, sabotage, combat refusals, and civilian attrition that could be more reasonably attributed to the prolongation of war that had lost any sense of purpose, certainly by 1969, 1970. By the time the myth of the addicted army reached its zenith in mid-1971, with proliferation of reports of the spread of heroin, it had already had a pronounced public impact. It helped divert public attention away from the policies that had perpetuated the Vietnam War, while at the same time intensifying public fears of the growth of the 1960s drug culture, and thus create an opportune political climate for an expansion of the federal drug war, which the Nixon administration would capitalize on. In preventing the kind of sustained soul-searching and rethink of values that might have emerged from an honest accounting of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the myth of the addicted army served a similar ideological function to 3 additional cultural myths related to the American experience in Vietnam. One of these myths is the prisoner of war myth. which the Nixon administration initially used to justify a prolongation of the war and later provided a rationale for condemning the peace settlement that ended it. Equally prominent in American popular, of course, on the prisoner of war myth, there's never been any evidence that's come about that the North Vietnamese government kept U.S. soldiers after were reached. This was part of the myth that was used to continue the U.S. involvement and later took root deeply within U.S. popular culture. Another myth is the so-called stab in the back myth, which bears resemblance to the German Dolchstoß legend after World War I. It blames weak-willed politicians, treasonous anti-war protesters, and dissenting journalists for providing the necessary moral support to the troops in Vietnam and constraining American military power, hence breeding defeat. Intricately connected is the spat-upon veteran myth, which indicts the anti-war movement for allegedly maltreating U.S. GIs upon their return home, even though hard evidence of such maltreatment is hard to come by. All of these myths have been promoted most vigorously by conservatives and neoconservatives, eager to justify the revival of an aggressive foreign policy after Vietnam, and the Vietnam-era anti-war movement. Each took root because of an unwillingness on the part of many Americans to bear responsibility for their actions, or the country's actions in Vietnam. Because the culture at large could not accept defeat at the hands of a, quote, inferior people, or, quote, raggedy-ass fourth-rate power, as Lyndon Johnson had characterized the Vietnamese, it searched for alternative explanations that became institutionalized over time. Together, these myths helped to preserve the nation's vision of righteousness and the dominant liberal internationalist creed, which asserted that America had both a duty and right to export liberal capitalist ideals in the developing world by force if necessary. The myths helped to refocus public hostility, moreover, on a series of scapegoats, including ineffectual bureaucrats, anti-war activists, and liberal journalists, along with the pernicious evil of drug abuse, which emerged as a symbol of the war's tragedy, whose eradication was deemed necessary to restore America's international credibility and prestige. The myth of the addicted army was promoted most vigorously by the mass media because explosive drug stories helped to sell papers and draw in viewers for television. Many journalists referred directly to Steinbeck's inflated estimates, which they accepted uncritically, and pointed to the ravaging effects of drug use in combat, even though such use was predominantly rare, it was mostly used in the rear. They adopted a narcophobic discourse encompassing lurid and Orientalist stereotypes depicting drugs as a foreign corrupting agent, reminiscent of the worst anti-drug propaganda campaigns of the past. Typical was a January 1971 Newsweek article entitled "The Troubled U.S. Army in Vietnam," which proclaimed the drug situation to be a nightmare. Even some of the medics were on heroin using needles from our own stores, the authors wrote, amidst lurid photos of high. You could see the punctures right up and down their arms. In fact, heroin use by needle was very, very rare in Vietnam. It was usually smoked when taken at all. The New York Times depicted GIs preoccupied with planning pot parties and too strung out to mount any effective military campaigns. Jack Anderson of the Washington Post wrote some of the most inflammatory pieces based on rumor and hearsay, claiming that soldiers on drugs were firing at their own troops, giving away military positions, and even selling military secrets such as the timing of bombing raids to prostitutes. Actually, there's no evidence to indicate that these charges are true. Again, drugs was used, but not to the extent pointed out in these articles. In fact, internal military reports studied the issue and depicted drug abuse as, quote, more of a minor problem, yielding no discernible impact on morale, health, welfare, efficiency, or combat effectiveness. The major problem in the military of public relations, how the stories of drug use, much like stories of atrocities that were coming out, were giving a bad reputation to the military. They were less concerned about the effect of drugs on combat performance, which got exaggerated. As during the Korean War, journalists portrayed the spread of drug abuse as a weapon of sabotage by communist agents. In November 1967, NBC anchorman Walter Cronkite proclaimed, quote, "The communists are battling American troops not only with firepower but with drugs." Internal military reports, however, we can see the distortion that sometimes play in the media. The military reports that I've studied at various archives, including the National Archives, showed that through a consultation with local intelligence, that the National Liberation Front, which was the southern-based resistance movement within Vietnam, rarely, this I'm quoting from military documents, rarely handled any drugs, and that, quote, the North Vietnamese and Chinese did not figure prominently in international narcotics trafficking due to strong anti-narcotics legislation.